Hello, friends. This isn't a tale of presidents or battles. It's slower, heavier, the kind of history that doesn't clamor for attention, but lingers in the rhythm of calloused hands, in the ache of backs bent beneath the sun, in the quiet hum of cities built on unseen labor. So, before you settle in, perhaps dim the lights, maybe light a candle, because now we travel deep into the forgotten, through fields cracked with dust, mills humming with endless wheels, rail lines stretching beneath mountain shadows, and farmlands heavy with sun and sweat. At the heart of it all, the ones who built a nation without a name, the voices never recorded, but whose work still holds the land together. Imagine yourself waking in their shoes and walking quietly through their world. Imagine the air before dawn, thick with dew, still holding the breath of the night. You're already awake, because sleep doesn't last long here. Not on a bed made of straw and damp earth. Not when the day starts before the sun. You are not free. You're a man in chains, cutting timber for a plantation outside Charleston, South Carolina. The trees here grow tall and slow, their trunks wide enough to swallow a man whole. Their sap clings to your skin like syrup. Your hands are blistered from the axe, not from one day's work, but from hundreds. Each swing is a rhythm, a slow, steady beat, the sound of survival. You are given no name here, just called boy, by those who own the land. Even though your back is bent like a man's, even though your arms carry the weight of houses, you eat cornbread when it's given, salt pork if the overseer is feeling generous, water from a tin bucket passed around at mid-morning, flies buzzing in your ears, sap sticking to your shirt, muscles aching from too many yesterdays. There are others beside you, men, women, even children, all moving in rhythm. No one speaks unless spoken to. The work is not cruel in its violence. It is cruel in its quietness, its repetition, its ability to erase the idea of a future. You don't dream anymore. You just sleep when it's allowed, and build when you're told. And somewhere, across the fields, a house is rising. Not your house, but it stands because of your hands. Now imagine you are someone else. Not a man, not enslaved, but a girl of 14, in the grey morning light of a New England mill town. You were born in County Clare, but that's far behind now. Here, the name Bridget is just enough to get by. The factory is already breathing when you arrive. Steam rolls out from the roof vents, mixing with the fog that clings to the river. Inside, the air is thick. Not hot, but wet and full of lint. Little white specks float in the sunlight, getting into your throat, your nose, your lungs. The looms are already rattling, wood and iron chattering like teeth. Your fingers move quickly, checking threads, adjusting spools, keeping rhythm with the machine. You've done this every day since you arrived. 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. No time for school, no time for play. But each week, you send part of your pay to your mother, still in a boarding house on the outskirts of town, still waiting for work. You share your boarding room with 3 other girls. At night, you write short verses in chalk on the inside of your trunk. Poems you'll never read aloud. Poems no one will keep. The other girls laugh softly at night, not because they're happy, but because it helps them sleep. And in the dark, your hands still twitch, mimicking the loom, even in your dreams. This is your life, not tragic, just ordinary. And that's what makes it easy to forget. But without girls like you, the Union Army would march into war naked, You weave the cloth of a nation, and yet your name will never be stitched into it. The first sound is always the bell, not a loud one, not a church bell or a town clock. Just a sharp clang from the boarding house hallway, a metal on metal ring that slices through dreams. Her name is Ellen, though the foreman calls her girl. She's 17, but she feels older in the mornings. Before the sun, before breakfast, before the machines. She rises in silence, hair still damp from yesterday's wash, feet sliding into shoes that never quite dried overnight. There's no time to think, only to move. The other girls stir beside her, some grumbling, some coughing, all of them dressing in the low light of a single candle. Downstairs, the table is set with bread, dry, a few slices each. Tea, if the boarding house keeper remembered to boil water. But most days, it's cold. Everything is cold. And outside, the factory waits. They arrive at the mill before the sun has finished rising. The sky is streaked with a grey so thin, it feels like the world hasn't fully woken. But the mill is already alive. Steam pours from the roof. Windows flicker with gaslight. Inside, the hum of looms is steady, constant. A second heartbeat beneath the chest. Ellen finds her station without a word. Her loom is in the second row, near the south wall. The light is better there. If she's lucky, she'll have sunlight by midday. The loom starts when the overseer pulls the main lever. The whole room shifts with a clatter. Gears bite, belts spin. Wood and metal begin their song. Ellen stands with one foot forward, one back, a posture learned through months of repetition. It keeps her steady when the loom jolts, keeps her from swaying. She ties threads, replaces spools, tightens bolts, brushes lint, moves like she's part of the machine. She is. Her shift will last 14 hours today. That's normal. Unless someone breaks a spindle, then it'll last longer. No one wants to be that someone. During her 10-minute break, Ellen writes. Always the same folded scrap of paper, always the same blunt pencil. She writes to her mother in New Hampshire. The letters are simple dash. How is the garden? Did the hens lay this spring? Did father find work? She never asks about herself. She never says she wakes up coughing some mornings. Never says she bled through her shoes last week. Never says she dreams of quiet. Instead, she writes about the river, about how it sparkles near the edge of the yard, how the geese fly overhead in neat little lines. She makes her life seem peaceful, so that her mother doesn't worry. The letters go out with the foreman every Saturday. He drops them in town. Sometimes they reach home. Sometimes they don't. She hasn't gotten a reply in months, but every week she still writes. By noon, the factory feels like it's sweating. The looms radiate heat, not just from the gears and belts, but from the bodies around them. Dozens of girls in rows, heads bent low, shoulders tight. Their aprons are dusted with cotton. Their eyes sting from the particles that float in the air, catching in lashes and throats alike. Ellen doesn't stop. Her fingers move in rhythm, tug, twist, pinch, knot. If a thread snaps, she notices before it curls away. She's good at noticing, even when she hasn't eaten, even when her back aches like it belongs to someone twice her age. Some girls hum while they work. Not Ellen. She counts. Every 100 turns of the wheel is a mental mark. Every bolt tightened is a silent victory. Every time she reaches for a new spool, she thinks of it as progress. A step forward, even if the floor beneath her feet never changes. The lunch bell is short and sharp. 15 minutes. She doesn't eat with the others today. Instead, she walks to the river, not far, just to the edge, where a low stone wall runs along the back of the mill yard. She sits, lets her feet rest, listens to the water move, slow, brown, indifferent. Her bread is half stale. She dips it in the river before chewing, softening the edges. It's not much, but it's something. Sometimes, when no one is looking, she closes her eyes, just for a few breaths. Not enough to sleep, just enough to remember what rest felt like. She dreams while awake, of hills, of quiet meals, of voices that say her name gently, not sharply. Then the bell rings again, and she stands, and she goes back in. Because the day isn't over, not yet. It was the second hour after lunch when it happened. The light outside had gone flat, that dull grey that hides the sun without offering shade. Inside the mill, the looms carried on, blind to weather, deaf to tired limbs. Ellen had just reached for a replacement shuttle. Her fingertips brushed the spindle, and then the floor gave way. Not really, of course, but her knees buckled in that slow, strange way. When the body moves without permission, when breath catches in the throat like a knot. The spinning floor tilted, the thread blurred, and then a hand caught her shoulder, hard, quick. Another girl, older, name unknown, no words exchanged, just a look, and a hand that stayed there, firm, for a moment longer than necessary. Ellen nodded, got up, kept working, but the moment clung to her, like the fibers in the air, like the ache in her spine. If she'd fallen, if her arm had caught between the gears, there would have been no scream. The machines were too loud for that. Just a red smear. A new girl brought in. The loom restarted. Work wouldn't stop. Not for one girl. Not for a dozen. That's what frightened her the most. Not the pain that might have come, but the silence that would have followed. At the end of the day, she ran her fingers over the wooden edge of the shuttle table. It still bore the splinter where she had lost her grip. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. And besides, she still had both arms. In the mill, that was as close to luck as anyone got. At night, after the bells stopped ringing and the dormitory creaked into silence, Ellen wrote letters in her head. Not on paper. Paper was precious. But in thoughts, slow and folded, like cloth between her palms. She imagined telling her mother everything. Not the full truth, not the danger or the hunger, but enough. She imagined saying, "The days are long, but I am managing. The machines are loud, but I've learned their rhythm. I think of home every time I smell fresh bread in the alley." She would picture her mother reading those words out loud, lips moving carefully, pausing now and then to smile, as if Ellen were closer than she was, but no letter was ever written, because there was no time, no ink, no stamps, and sometimes no point. Other girls sent letters. One had a father who kept them, tied in blue string. Another said her brother burned hers by the fire to read them by light. But Ellen didn't trust the post, not because it lost things, though it did, but because it might work. And if it worked, it might pull her back. Back to fields that paid nothing. Back to a family already stretched thin. Here at least, she had shoes. Most days anyway. And so the letters stayed folded inside her. Sometimes She stitched her words into scraps of fabric, tiny lines of crooked embroidery, poems no one would read. She'd tuck them into her apron pocket, then forget them for days, until they were just threads again. Once, a matron found one, held it up to the light, read the crooked verse aloud. "If the moon can fit through this window, then so can I someday." The woman didn't say anything. She just put the scrap back down and walked away. Ellen burned that one in the stove that night, not from fear, but from softness. It was the only thing she owned, and she couldn't risk losing it to someone else's eyes again. Some girls counted the days until they could leave. Ellen did not. She had heard the stories of those who left the mills and married or moved west, or took teaching positions in small towns with quiet streets. A few even returned to their parents' farms, with a little money tucked into the lining of their shoes. But Ellen had nothing to return to. Her father had passed 2 winters after she left. Her mother could barely hold the cottage roof in place, and her younger siblings, last she heard, were working in fields that didn't grow much anymore. To go back was to disappear, to be needed in a way that cost her everything. So she stayed, not because she loved the mill, but because it was something that, however cruel, she had carved a place in. There was a rhythm here, a smell, a familiar ache. She knew which steps creaked in the boarding house, which spools were likely to jam, which supervisors to avoid, which girls would offer you a crust of bread when your wages were docked again. These were her walls, her ceilings, her ghosts. There were moments of stillness. Once a month, on Sunday afternoons, the mill allowed the girls to walk into town. Not far, not alone, but enough. They'd go to the riverbank, where the looms couldn't follow. They'd sit in clusters, dresses washed with lye, and comb out their hair in long, careful strokes. Sometimes they'd sing, not loudly. They weren't children anymore, but enough to remind themselves there were notes beyond the clatter of machinery. Ellen didn't always sing. She listened. To the water, the wind through cottonwood leaves, the strange hum of silence when it was finally allowed. In those hours, she could almost forget the thread burns on her fingers, the bruises from a snapped spindle, the wheeze in her chest that came and went, but never left entirely. She'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher. Back in school, when her hands were still clean, and ink came in glass bottles, not scraps stolen from the mill office. She was good with words. She liked quiet. She could remember entire poems after hearing them just once. But that was before the mill, before days so long she forgot how to sit still, before sleep became more urgent than thought. Now, when she tried to read, the words swam. Her eyes would close too quickly, and when they opened, the poem would be gone. Still, she taught in her own way. To the new girls, the scared ones, the ones who flinched at every whistle. She'd show them how to fold the cloth without slicing their palms, how to time their shifts so they could sneak sips of water without notice, how to listen to the machines like they were teachers themselves. It wasn't a school, but it was survival, and that too was a kind of education. There was no warning, no farewell, just an empty spot at the loom. Ellen had not come down with the others that morning. Her shoes were still by her bed, the pillow still faintly warm, but her body remained curled under the coarse wool blanket, breath shallow, skin damp. The matron didn't say much, just told another girl to take her place. In the mill, absence was never dramatic. It was practical, necessary. an interruption to be patched like torn thread. The supervisor walked past the new girl twice before remembering her name. Ellen's name, once so constant on the shift log, was scratched out with a dull pencil. She didn't die that day. Not exactly. But her life, as the mill knew it, ended. She was moved to the infirmary. A room without looms, but not without noise. Groans, the scrape of tin bowls, the faint, persistent coughs that echoed from bed to bed. Some girls recovered, some didn't. There was no announcement either way. Ellen lay still, watching dust dance in the early light. She was aware, vaguely, of the world moving on without her, of spindles turning, of threads spooling past the place where her hands used to be. One night, she wrote something on a square of discarded cloth. A few lines from a poem she could no longer fully remember. She stitched the words with trembling fingers, threading her needle with more care than strength. It wasn't meant for anyone, not really. But when she finished, she folded the cloth and placed it beneath the thin mattress. A final entry in a life no ledger ever cared to record. The next day, the bed was empty. No one asked where she went. Perhaps she was sent to her mother. Perhaps to a charity hospital. Perhaps not far at all. There were rumors, but no proof. Her name was not spoken again. The mill continued, indifferent and vast. The loom that had once known her hands did not stop. Another girl stepped in, eyes wide, knuckles raw. She moved stiffly, as if the machine would bite, and in a way it would. But there was no choice. Not for her, not for any of them. Weeks later, during a sweep of the infirmary, a matron found the stitched cloth. She held it up to the light, squinting at the words. They were misspelled. The thread was uneven, but something in them caught her. She folded it again, slipped it into her apron, and said nothing. It would never be framed, never displayed, never read aloud in any hall. But it existed, a whispering thread, proof that Ellen had once been there. Not just to labor, but to feel, to speak, to leave something behind, no matter how small. The construction crew didn't expect to find anything. They were digging in Lower Manhattan, a place where everything had already been built, rebuilt, paved over, and forgotten. It was supposed to be a routine expansion. New foundations for a federal office building, nothing remarkable. But just beneath the surface, their tools struck something different. Not pipes, not stone, but bone. Dozens at first, then hundreds. The work halted, and archaeologists were called in. What they uncovered was not a graveyard in the traditional sense, not rows of tombstones or orderly plots. There were no names, no markers, no indication that anyone had meant to remember what lay below. But there, beneath layers of earth and centuries of asphalt, was a massive burial ground. And the people buried there, thousands of them, were mostly African, men, women, children, enslaved, free, or somewhere in between. The soil held no answers, only clues. The site would come to be known as the African Burial Ground National Monument. But for generations, it had simply been ignored. Its existence erased by maps, its occupants forgotten by history. In the 1700s, this area had been outside the formal city boundary. Slavery was legal in New York then. In fact, for a time, more enslaved Africans lived in New York than in any other American city except Charleston. These individuals weren't buried in family plots. They had no ornate tombs or elaborate markers. Often, they were laid to rest at night. After long days of labor in hastily dug graves, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes with nothing at all. Some bodies bore signs of injury. Others showed signs of strenuous labor. Worn joints, bent spines, teeth ground down from stress. But even in death, they were not entirely invisible. Traces of culture remained. Beads beside a child's wrist, shells near a woman's feet, small charms that hinted at beliefs and traditions, carried across an ocean and kept alive in silence. Forensic teams began the slow process of documentation. Each skeleton was catalogued, measured, examined. The researchers did not know their names, but they could read the signs their bodies left behind. A man with fused vertebrae, likely from carrying heavy loads. A young girl with enamel defects on her teeth. Evidence of childhood malnutrition. A woman who had lived long past her expected years. Her joints worn, but her bones strong. A quiet testament to resilience. When the remains were reinterred years later, it was with ceremony, music, words, offerings, and though their names remained unknown, something had changed. They had been seen, not as labor, not as numbers, but as lives, brief, painful, enduring. And in the heart of the city they helped build, they were given ground that would no longer forget them. It wasn't just in New York. All across the country, the soil keeps secrets. Sometimes it's farmland. Sometimes it's a city sidewalk. Sometimes it's just a wooded path where no one thought to look. But every now and then, someone does. And what they find are traces, not names, not declarations, but pieces of labor, forgotten hands, left behind in the form of what they held, what they built, what they dropped. In the Carolinas, archaeologists working near an old rice plantation found rows of shallow depressions. They weren't graves, at least not in the usual sense. They were worker quarters, gone now, collapsed, buried, grown over. But inside the earth, they found fragments of daily life. A bent spoon, the worn edge of a clay pipe, a comb made from animal bone. There were shards of pottery, not fine china, but thick and plain, the kind used to serve bulk meals to dozens at once. There were buttons, not all the same, which meant clothing was often repurposed, shared, patched again and again, and tucked into one corner, almost missed at a tiny carved bead. It didn't match anything else. It was shaped by hand, smoothed, darkened by years of touch. Maybe a charm, maybe a toy, maybe a keepsake from someone who had nothing else to keep. In a Nevada desert, near an old railroad cut, a university team dug through what looked like just another pile of trash. Cans, broken glass, rusty metal. But under the debris, they found orderly rows of stones, and under those, ashes. Someone once had lived here, cooked here, buried something here. They were Chinese laborers, brought in to build the railroads. Workers who blasted tunnels through rock, laid tracks across endless plains, and lived in makeshift camps no bigger than a shed. They weren't welcomed, not even when the work was done. Many of them died far from the villages they came from. And in that stretch of desert, their memory faded. But here, in the ash and soot, archaeologists found tea bricks, imported, wrapped in fragile paper, a luxury, carefully packed, carefully brewed. There were porcelain bowls, cracked but whole, and shoes, small ones, stitched with care. These weren't just laborers. They were people carrying a culture with them, trying to hold on to something soft. In a world made of steel and dust, in each of these places, the past doesn't shout. It murmurs, through objects, through absence, and as the wind moves across empty fields or through subway grates, it brushes against memories that were never meant to be buried. Memories that waited patiently for someone to notice. The plantations of the American South stretched wide, fields of cotton and sugarcane swaying in the heat, as if the land breathed under the sun. But under that soil, deeper than roots, lay something else. Graves, hundreds, thousands, unmarked, unmapped, unknown. For generations, enslaved men, women, and children worked the fields. Their sweat soaked the soil. Their hands broke it open. Their footprints wore paths between rows. When they died, from exhaustion, disease, childbirth, or punishment, they were buried nearby. Not in family plots, not beneath headstones, just earth. A corner of a field, a shady patch behind the sugar mill, anywhere not in use. And over time, those spots were forgotten. The crops returned. The trees grew. The graves disappeared beneath them. But the dead do not vanish. In one Louisiana cane field, a crew excavating for irrigation stumbled upon something strange. Bones. Old, worn smooth. Some tiny, infants. Some bent, adults who had worked too long. There were no coffins, just shallow depressions. Cloth fragments. A rusted iron nail, likely used to fasten a shroud or hold together crude boards. Archaeologists were called in. What they found were the outlines of lives lived out of sight. Traces of disease in the bones, malnutrition in the teeth, spines curved unnaturally, from bending too long over crops that weren't theirs. But alongside those signs of hardship, they found other things too. A simple pendant made of copper wire. Carved shells arranged in a pattern. Maybe decorative, maybe symbolic. A clay pipe with an African design, suggesting a connection held across oceans and time. Even in forced labor, people found ways to leave their mark, to claim something, even if it was only a corner of the earth no one wanted. Not far away, in a Georgia field, a survey crew found a ring of stones. At first, they thought it was debris, but as they cleared it, they realized it encircled a hollow. A grave. Inside were bone fragments, and tucked beside them, a spoon with initials. No one knew whose. There was no record. The plantation's ledgers listed only first names, or none at all. But someone had taken the time to carve letters into cheap tin. And that meant something. These graves speak, not loudly, not clearly, but they do speak. Of toil, of persistence, of people whose names were left off monuments, but who shaped the land just the same. The cotton they picked clothed cities. The sugar they harvested sweetened tables. And the dirt they were buried in still remembers them, even if no one else does. The American West is full of empty shafts, mountains split open by ambition, hills drilled for copper, silver, gold, and beneath it all, men who vanished in the dark. In the 19th century, as railroads pushed west and cities sprouted like weeds, the hunger for minerals deepened. Nevada, Colorado, Montana. Mining camps bloomed, then withered. leaving behind rusted equipment, broken carts, and graves with no names. Some workers came chasing fortune. Most came chasing survival. Mexican laborers, Chinese migrants, Welsh miners with lungs already full of coal dust. They worked side by side, but rarely on equal terms. The deeper you went into the earth, the cheaper your life became. The highest risk shafts, poorly ventilated, prone to collapse, were often assigned to those who spoke little English, or none at all. One collapsed shaft in Butte, Montana, yielded no bodies, just fragments, a boot, a lantern, a rusted tobacco tin with a crude engraving, a mountain, and what looked like initials, JP, or maybe YP. It was hard to tell. There were no missing person reports from that year, no family inquiries. The company had moved on. But the layer of soot told its own story. The tunnel had caved, and whoever was inside had not been pulled out, just left, buried in the very earth he helped empty. In southern Arizona, archaeologists examining a long-abandoned silver site found something wedged in a crack behind a wall of slag. A small wooden tag, faded, water-warped, but with one word still legible. Niño. Child. He had been a boy, working in a mine. They later found child-sized gloves, patched too many times to hold shape. The fingertips were worn flat. A historian reviewing the company's records noted that child labor wasn't officially recorded at that mine, but off the books, it was common. Boys worked as bellows tenders, air pump runners, mule feeders, the kind of jobs that required small bodies, quick hands, and a silence that didn't ask questions. These men and boys dug into mountains for metal that built the telegraph, wired the railroads, and filled the teeth of wealthy Easterners, but their own names rarely made it home. In some ghost towns, cemeteries remain, mostly wood markers, half-rotted, scrawled with only first names or nicknames: Manuel, Red, Toothless, Chang. One marker simply read, "Died digging." That was all. And yet, that was everything. Beneath the mines, beneath the ash and slag, lies a history not of riches, but of lives spent in pursuit of them. Given for wages never paid, and graves never marked. The mountains remember. The tunnels still echo, not with picks or footsteps, but with the quiet breath of those who once lived in the dark. The great railroads of America stretch for thousands of miles. Iron veins laid across plains, deserts, and mountains. They connected the coasts. They built cities. They shrank a continent. But they came at a cost buried just out of sight. For every mile of track, an untold number of workers lost their lives, especially in the West, where the land was harsh and labor came cheap. Many of the workers were Chinese immigrants, recruited in the 1860s by companies eager for low wages and tireless work. They were given picks, baskets, and gunpowder, sent into cliffs and canyons, told to carve paths through granite by hand. And when the explosions went wrong, when tunnels collapsed, when boulders fell, bodies were often left where they lay. The work could not stop. Time was money, and graves, if dug at all, were shallow. In a remote section of the Sierra Nevada, a group of hikers stumbled upon something strange. A row of stones, barely visible in the brush, laid in a line beside the tracks. No markers, no names, just careful arrangement. As if someone long ago had tried to honor the dead with what they had. Later, Local archives confirmed what was suspected. That section of the track had claimed dozens of lives. During its construction in 1867, few were recorded, even fewer were recovered. The bones found near railroad camps tell quiet stories. Compact skulls suggesting young men, spines worn down from carrying timber and iron rails, teeth filed flat from diets of hard rice and dried fish. One site yielded a shallow grave with two bodies laid side by side. Between them, a coin. Chinese script still faintly visible. A coin placed for the afterlife. A practice from home, far from home. White labourers, too, are found in these forgotten rail corridors. Many were Irish, or formerly enslaved, or poor Americans pushed westward by hunger. They were given the same tools, faced the same dangers, died in the same dirt, but the records rarely mentioned them either. In one rail company ledger, a single entry noted, "Lost one man, no delay." Sometimes the only trace is a work boot, or a tin mug with a dent. At one dig in Utah, archaeologists found a camp stove surrounded by ash, and next to it, a small wooden box. Inside were buttons, carefully cleaned, wrapped in cloth. Someone had taken the time to collect them, perhaps intending to mend clothes, perhaps remembering someone who would not return. The trains still run, fast now, silent behind glass and steel, but beside the tracks, under grass and gravel, the bones of those who built them still rest, unclaimed, unmarked, but not forgotten. At least, not here. In New Jersey, construction crews were digging the foundation for a new shopping center. When the backhoe struck something solid, it wasn't a pipe or rock, it was wood. Rotten, layered wood, blackened by time. At first, they thought it was an old floorboard, but beneath it, they found bones, dozens of them. The site was paused. Archaeologists were called in, and soon the truth emerged. They had uncovered the remains of a 19th century labor camp. It hadn't been on any modern maps. No monument, no plaque. But beneath the asphalt and rebar, there had once been a village, a forgotten one. The settlement was called Mucktown, though no official record had preserved the name. It had housed dock workers and canal diggers, men who carried stone by hand, women who boiled wash water over open fires. They lived in tar paper shacks, lined with cloth to block the wind. The ground beneath them flooded every spring, so they stacked planks to walk on. One child who lived there wrote, years later, that his only toy was a spool of thread and a stick. He never knew the place had a name. He only called it the low part. The excavation revealed the details no ledger ever did. A comb with missing teeth, a doll's head, half crushed, eyes worn smooth, a spoon carved from scrap metal. Beneath one collapsed structure, they found a tin sign nailed to a beam. Faded letters spelled out, Room 3. It had been a boarding house, 3 rooms, each with 10 people. No running water, one stove. The discovery prompted a brief local news story. A few historians petitioned to halt the mall's construction. But the project went ahead. The bones were respectfully removed, catalogued, reburied elsewhere, and the parking lot was poured. Smooth, flat and grey. No one shopping there today knows what lies beneath their feet. But the past doesn't vanish. It only waits. This was not the only case. In Detroit, workers uncovered the remains of an early automotive shanty town. Shelters thrown together by migrant laborers who laid the foundation for the factories above. In Atlanta, a highway expansion dug into the side of a black sharecropper community. Dozens of house foundations, ceramic shards, broken fence posts. In each case, the discoveries were accidental, but meaningful. Each shovel of dirt peeled back layers of unrecorded history, and the people found beneath. They weren't ghosts. They were workers, mothers, children, builders. Not every legacy is built in stone. Some are buried under concrete, under neon signs, under the noise of cities, but they're still there. And sometimes, if the ground cracks just right, they whisper their stories again. The desert doesn't bury things quickly. It bakes them, preserves them in silence. Outside of Elko, Nevada, long past the reach of highways, where scrub brush clings to dust, and the sun forgets to set gently, a discovery halted construction. A few bones, at first assumed to be animal, then a boot, then a row of shallow graves, laid along what was once a temporary rail camp. The year was never written, but the evidence told its own version, 1868, give or take. Right in the thick of the transcontinental railroad push. These weren't soldiers. They weren't settlers. They were workers, likely Chinese, based on forensic analysis. Men who came from Guangdong and Fujian, who crossed an ocean to lay steel through the rock and salt of the American West. Their names were never recorded. They didn't own land. They weren't counted in censuses. In many towns, they weren't even allowed to stay overnight. But they left traces. The bones told of fractures healed on their own. Spines curved from carrying timbers. Knees worn from kneeling. And in one grave, a coin placed in the mouth. An old tradition, carried thousands of miles, and placed gently, even here. They worked through avalanches. They worked during snowstorms. They worked with little food, less water, and almost no safety. When they died, no tombstones marked the loss. Just soil, a boot, and silence. These graves weren't meant to be found, but they were, and now they rest again. Not in erasure, but in quiet recognition, in the heart of Louisiana, where the air turns syrup thick in August, and the sugarcane fields stretch like green oceans. There is a patch of land that once whispered, not to the wind, but to the archaeologists who came looking for something else entirely. They were expecting pipes, a foundation maybe, remnants of a collapsed storehouse. Instead, they found teeth, human teeth, and then femurs, then rows. The field had once been part of a plantation, one of hundreds that stretched from Baton Rouge to the Gulf. This one specialized in sugar, a crop known for chewing through bodies as quickly as it chewed through machetes. The bones belonged to men and boys, some no older than 15. Most had no signs of formal burial, no coffins, no ceremony, just the red clay of southern Louisiana, pressing down on lives lost without record. Forensic teams noted extreme wear on joints, shoulders that had torn repeatedly, spines that compressed under constant loads, toes malformed from ill-fitting shoes, or no shoes at all. These weren't enslaved people from the early 1800s. They were convict laborers, post-Civil War. Because after slavery ended, the South found a loophole. Imprisoned black men, often for the smallest infractions like vagrancy or speaking too loud, and lease them out to plantations. It was called convict leasing, and it made the state of Louisiana more money than any other post-war industry. The men buried in that field likely worked from before dawn, until night swallowed the cane stalks. They were whipped, starved, beaten for resting, punished for falling behind. Many never left. The company kept little record of them. The state didn't ask. Their families were never told. And when they died, when heat stroke or infection or exhaustion finally took them, they were buried without markers, without prayers, without names. When the excavation ended, the remains were respectfully reinterred. But for a brief moment, the silence of that sugarcane field lifted, and beneath the rustle of green stalks, the ground gave up a fragment of its memory. Sometimes, what's left behind isn't a body. It's the outline of a life. And sometimes that outline is made of iron. In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, where the mines used to breathe fire into the sky, a team of archaeologists uncovered a scatter of tools. Rusted picks, broken shovels, bent chisels. Nothing grand, nothing gold, just the humble weight of labor. The site was once part of a mining camp, one of hundreds that dotted the Appalachian Range in the 1800s. Coal was king, and kings demand tribute. The tools were found beside what looked like collapsed shanties. Wooden walls long since turned to mulch, but nails still clenched the corners in place. They uncovered fire pits ringed with stone, the charred bones of rabbits inside. One team member noted how small the hammers were, lighter than expected, not made for adult hands, because the mines needed boys, quick, flexible bodies that could crawl where adults could not, the kind of bodies that could slip into vent shafts and come back out, soot-streaked and coughing. Records showed that some children started as early as 8. They were paid less than half of what adults made, if they were paid at all. Sometimes their wages were sent straight to the company store, deducted before the child ever saw a coin. One rusted lunch tin was found buried near a stone wall. Inside it, a single button, a folded scrap of cloth, and a small tin whistle, still faintly green with corrosion. Maybe it belonged to a child who left it there before descending into the mine. Maybe it was buried intentionally, a small private ritual to ward off the dark. The whistle didn't make it into any museum exhibit. Too fragile, too ordinary. But for the team, it said enough. That someone had been there. That someone had feared the dark. The tools told the rest of the story. Not how they worked, but how often they broke. Handles worn smooth by repeated use. Edges chipped, then filed, then chipped again. They were never meant to last forever. Neither were the men and boys who used them. But in this field, long since overgrown with sumac and moss, the forgotten miners left behind a catalogue of persistence. No names, no photos, just the curve of a handle, the weight of iron, and a silence that still hums beneath the soil. Imagine standing beside a railroad track that stretches beyond the horizon. Steel glinting in the sun. Gravel crunching beneath your feet. The air smells faintly of rust and sagebrush. You wouldn't guess just by looking that beneath this railbed, beneath tons of rock and steel, lie bones. In the American West, archaeologists have uncovered traces of the men who laid the tracks, not the celebrated engineers, but the workers, the nameless. Many were Chinese immigrants, brought across the Pacific with the promise of work, and work they did. They blasted through granite, bridged ravines, laid thousands of miles of track in blistering heat and bitter cold. Their camps were often built just out of sight. Beyond the bend of a hill, downwind from the white settlements, They cooked rice and dried fish. They brewed tea in tin kettles. They spoke in dialects unfamiliar to most Americans at the time. And they died, quietly, from collapses, from frostbite, from explosions that didn't wait. There are no grave markers, no memorials beside the rails. But beneath the soil, archaeologists have found clues. Charred cooking pits filled with cracked bones, ceramic bowls with brush-painted designs, even a small game board carved into rock. One site revealed a line of carefully arranged stones, positioned like a miniature wall. At first, it puzzled the team. Later, a historian recognized it. A feng shui barrier, meant to ward off misfortune from a spirit path. The builders had brought their beliefs with them, even into exile, even to the edges of the desert. And in their camp trash, they found medicine bottles, some with Western labels, some etched with Chinese characters. One bore the residue of powdered ginseng. Another smelled faintly of camphor. Even after 100 years underground, the camps had rhythm, routine, rice washed, fires lit, shifts rotated. And then, silence. Because when the railroad moved on, the workers didn't always follow. Some settled, some vanished. Others remained in the soil, their lives packed into the foundation of the tracks they built. A train passes overhead, rattling the earth. It doesn't know the names, but the names are there. In the worn chopsticks, in the collapsed tents, in the silence where a voice once called for water. Far from the sweltering fields and sun-bleached railways, deep within the dense pine forests of the northern Midwest, another kind of laborer once swung their axes in rhythm with the wind. Logging camps, isolated, temporary, and mostly vanished. They moved with the trees, cleared a section of forest, then vanished into the next. But now and then, archaeologists find traces beneath the moss, iron nails curled by frost, boot soles worn smooth, a tin harmonica, rusted but still recognizable. The workers who lived here were often immigrants from Scandinavia, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Some had fled famine. Others had chased promises of land or wages. They came with songs, with wool coats that didn't always hold back the cold, and with the strength of men used to silence. The camps were bare bones, rows of bunkhouses built from rough timber, a cook shack always smoking, a sharpening shed for axes and saws. They woke before dawn, ate flapjacks, beans, and salted meat, then worked until the trees stopped falling, or the light disappeared behind clouds of snow. But even these hard, transient lives left stories. At one site in Minnesota, a collapsed shack yielded. A clay pipe, a comb made from bone, and a pair of leather mittens with initials burned into the palm. The initials were unfamiliar. No census matched them. Perhaps the man left. Perhaps he didn't. In another logging site, a collection of metal tags was discovered. Each bore a different number. Researchers believe they were tally markers, assigned to each worker, used to track how many logs they felled per day. One man's marker had dozens of notches carved into the back. For luck, for memory. The forest doesn't answer. It only grows back. In the stillness of those woods today, you can almost hear the soft crunch of boots on snow, the distant ring of axe on trunk, and the low hum of men too tired to speak. Their cabins are gone, their names not written, but in the disturbed soil where root met blade, their labor still breathes. It holds in the stumps, in the timber that built rail cars, barns, and bridges, and in the whisper of wind through trees that once fell with a cry. Not all memory is carved in stone. Some of it was scratched into wood, burned into tin, stitched into fabric, or whispered between shifts and sleep. And some of it never intended to be remembered at all. Across excavation sites from the East Coast to the West, researchers sometimes find names, short, incomplete, and often surrounded by silence. One wooden beam beneath a textile mill bore the faint, knife-scratched word, Annie. No last name, no date, just Annie. Was she a worker, a visitor, or did someone carve the name to remember someone they lost? No records remain, but the beam still holds the curve of the letters, etched with enough care to mean something. In a California orchard, under the remains of a packing shed, a child's boot was discovered. Inside the heel, someone had tucked a tiny paper note, faded, water-damaged, and mostly illegible. Only a few words survived. We'll be back for you. A promise, a farewell, or just something a child wrote to keep themselves company. The people who built America, who picked its cotton, laid its bricks, stitched its uniforms, hauled its stone, and turned its machines, did not expect to be remembered. They did not leave memoirs. They left grooves. They left wear, handle imprints in old tools, smooth spots on floorboards where feet stood for decades, walls darkened where backs leaned. Their names faded faster than the wood rotted. But what they built did not. Their labor remains. In the bones of cities, the shape of fields, the veins of rail across the land. Some graves are marked only by stones turned on their side, others not at all. But every shovel in the dirt is a reminder that history doesn't vanish. It just waits. Sometimes in the corner of a cellar, sometimes beneath cracked plaster, and sometimes in the silence between rusted nails. These were the people who never led, never signed laws, never got their portraits painted, but they held the walls up. And in the end, that's the kind of legacy that outlasts names. While thousands toiled in fields and factories, other lives unfolded behind velvet curtains. On Beacon Hill in Boston, there were parlor rooms washed in warm afternoon light, floorboards polished to a dull gleam, mirrors framed in gold leaf, a pianoforte resting quietly in the corner. The lady of the house rose late. She had a girl to lace her corset. An Irish maid, just 16. She had gloves to match her bonnet, books to arrange in the sitting room. Her husband was a mill owner. He dined at the club downtown. He knew the names of every machine in his factory, but not the names of the girls who operated them. He didn't need to. They were paid in script and silence. Their labor bought him books and scotch and weekends by the shore. He spoke of the virtues of industry. He gave to churches. He praised hard work, but never did it. And when the girl in the factory coughed blood, and another took her place, he never noticed the difference. In a southern plantation home, a different rhythm, ceilings high to fight the heat, ceiling fans spinning slow and lazy, curtains drawn against the dust. The mistress of the house wore lace gloves, powdered her face in the mirror, and rang a bell when she wanted tea. She lived in silence, but it wasn't hers. It was the kind enforced by fear. Every dish served to her, every sheet changed beneath her, every piece of clothing she wore, handled by someone who would never sit at her table. She liked to paint. Watercolors of flowers. She hung them in the hallway. That led to the nursery. In the nursery, her own children played. with the children of the enslaved, until one day they were no longer allowed to. Lines were drawn with age and with law, and the girl who once passed a doll across the floor became someone who was only spoken to, with orders. The white children went to school. The others learned silence. In these homes, textile, plantation, railroad barren, wealth floated on surfaces, cream in the tea, glint of silver, clean boots on a dry doorstep. But beneath those surfaces were the fingerprints of the forgotten, and in every polished floor, someone else had scrubbed. In a Manhattan drawing room, a railroad baron sat with two friends. Lawyers, financiers, men with clean fingernails, and voices that never rose above a murmur. The fire crackled softly. Their shoes were warm. The cigars were lit. On the table sat a bottle of port, older than the Chinese boy laying steel in the Sierra. They discussed expansion, new lines westward, coal, labor, progress. No one in the room had ever driven a spike. None had braved the mountain passes or collapsed from heat stroke in the desert sun. Yet they spoke of our line, our workforce, our engine of prosperity. They spoke of America, as if it were a thing they'd carved themselves, from oak and granite. But their hands were soft, their boots clean, their beds warm. The gap between builder and owner was not just a line of class. It was a chasm, one filled with stitched shirts, cooked meals, laid bricks, and endless silence. Inside these mansions, no soot stained the curtains. No one coughed from cotton dust. No back was bent except in dance or in leisure. And yet the buildings stood because others bent first. The books on their shelves, written by men who never picked tomatoes, or ran from overseers in the night. Their dinner guests quoted poetry, never knowing someone in the servants' corridor once tried to write their own, in chalk on walls no one would see. In every corner of elite America, there were hints of the unseen, a crack in the marble step, where a maid slipped but didn't dare complain, a dent in the silver tray, from when a tired hand trembled, under too much weight, a scuff on the wallpaper, from the shoulder of a porter, carrying trunks for a family who didn't remember his name. Traces, not memories, not stories, but traces. This was the America enjoyed, not the America made. And for all their wealth, the elite forgot one truth. A nation isn't built by those who dine at the top of it. It's built by the ones who are never invited to the table. There are no parades for the ones who built the roads. No golden statues for the girl who spun the thread, that clothed the soldier, who never knew her name. History tends to look upward, toward generals, inventors, founding fathers, voices etched in ink. But beneath it all, quiet and unmoving, is the foundation they stood on, the backs they climbed, the hands that never stopped moving, even when the record books did. There's something strange about an empty house. You walk in, and the air feels still, but not silent. You sense the lives once lived inside it. The way the floorboards dip just slightly near the kitchen table, where someone always stood to cook. A worn patch on the stair, a window latch rubbed smooth. These aren't accidents, they're imprints. And the story of America, for all its declarations and celebrations, has far more of these than it does monuments. The enslaved man, whose fingerprints still rest in the wood grain of a southern barn. The mill girl, whose final breath was woven into yards of cloth no one remembers. The Chinese laborer, who vanished between mountains, to connect east to west, his bones still lying beneath a forgotten rail. The Mexican picker, whose hands bled onto tomatoes, stacked in crates stamped fresh. They weren't heroes, not in the way textbooks tell it. They were human, tired, brave in small ways, unseen in large ones. Imagine all the people who ever lived, but were never written down. Not because they did nothing, but because they never owned the pen. And still, they built and cooked and stitched and shoveled and swept. They raised the walls. They filled the fields. They lifted the cities. And then quietly, they left, one by one, without ceremony, without stories. There is a power in remembering that doesn't require names. To notice the seam in a jacket and think of the hand that pulled the thread, to bite into fruit and picture the heat beneath someone's hat, to walk through a park and know the ground was leveled by someone who never got to walk there for pleasure. Even now, if you dig in the right places, you'll find traces, not artifacts, but absences, rooms without records, ledgers without surnames, work done and long forgotten. But it's still there, beneath the layers, behind the glass, under your feet, and in the very fabric of the country. America is not just a nation of ideals, it is a nation of effort. Not just speeches and signatures, but nails hammered into beams by someone who didn't understand the language, but understood survival. Not just bold pioneers, but quiet continuers. Those who stayed, who endured, who woke up and worked, without ever being asked how they felt about it. And in the end, that's what remains. The grand buildings crumble, the portraits fade, the names wear thin on stone. But the rhythm of labor, the echo of footsteps in places that used to matter, those are harder to erase. So let this be the story, or at least part of it, of the ones no one talks about, the ones who never left a name, the ones who built and bent and bore the weight, the forgotten people who held up a country, not with dreams, but with their days, and whose silence deserves to be heard, at least once more. Ledgers without surnames, work done and long forgotten, but it's still there, beneath the layers, behind the glass, under your feet, and in the very fabric of the country. America is not just a nation of ideals, it is a nation of effort. Not just speeches and signatures, but nails hammered into beams by someone who didn't understand the language, but understood survival. Not just bold pioneers, but quiet continuers. Those who stayed, who endured, who woke up and worked, without ever being asked how they felt about it. And in the end, that's what remains. The grand buildings crumble, the portraits fade, the names wear thin on stone, but the rhythm of labor, the echo of footsteps in places that used to matter, those are harder to erase. So let this be the story, or at least part of it, of the ones no one talks about, the ones who never left a name, the ones who built and bent and bore the weight, the forgotten people who held up a country, not with dreams, but with their days, and whose silence deserves to be heard, at least once more.